Okay, welcome everyone. Happy Thursday. Today we have another beautiful Tubman Talks on this beautiful Thursday afternoon. I'm Dr. Bianca Beauchemin. I'm an assistant professor in the School of Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies, and I'm also a member of the executive committee here at the Tubman Institute. So Tubman Talks, which is what we're doing today, is a space and a platform to share research and publications with audiences who are doing work related to or interested in Africa and the African diaspora. The Tubman community is interdisciplinary, and we welcome a wide range of topics and backgrounds. Tubman Talks are intended to provide an opportunity for individual scholars to critically strengthen their own research by presenting it to others in the spirit of engaging in debate. Before I introduce not our speaker, but our speakers with this wonderful round table that we have today, I do want to take the time to make a land acknowledgement. I wanted to acknowledge our presence on the traditional territory of many indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been taken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is governed by the Dishwood One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peacefully share and care for the Great Lakes region. In making this land acknowledgement, I honor and acknowledge the land and its people who have been here for thousands of years. In relation, I would be remiss not to mention the current genocide happening in Gaza and the catastrophic situations in Sudan, Congo, and Haiti. It's important to contextualize the repressive colonial and imperial oppressions that undergird the current situation. Influenced by my Black feminist politics, scholarship, and praxis in various movements, I do recognize that my political commitment, mandates, and solidarity are bound up and intertwined with the liberation and self-determination of indigenous people, as well as Palestinian, Sudanese, Congolese, and Haitian peoples. So today, as I alluded to before, we have a roundtable, which is really exciting. And the title of the presentation is The Possibilities and Constraints of Researching and Writing About African Women. And I can't think of a better place to have this conversation than the Tubman Institute. The abstract reads, studies focusing on the lives and experience of African women have been central to the formation and advancement of African studies. Scholars have compellingly demonstrated that the focus on African women's lives and action opens up new fields of inquiry and complicate dominant, usually androcentric framework and understanding of the African past, present, and future. Yet, despite the critical and new insight scholarship on African women has brought to African studies, the canon continues to categorize the field as a subfield or separate from mainstream foci. This dominant male-centered framing continues to inform the conceptual framing about African women, which obscures African women's way of knowing or co-opts inquiries about African women to advance and replicate masculinist inquiries. In addition to these challenges, the scarcity of resources, particularly documentary resources on African women and the colonial and androcentric nature of many of the sources, further makes it challenging to write and research about African women. To understand the evolution and future of African studies, the participant in this roundtable will explore the various possibilities and constraints of researching and writing about African women by drawing on their individual research focus and experiences. They will discuss the research methodologies they bring to bear on a variety of sources contained in established and less known archives and advance the need to establish new archives and methodologies to deepen knowledge about African women and, relatably, African studies. So let's begin. I will go this way, linearly, chronologically. All right. So first we have Vanessa S. Oliveira. She is an associate professor of African history in the Department of History at the Royal Military College of Canada in Kingston. She teaches courses on European colonialism, women and gender, research methodologies, and early and modern Africa. Her research interests include slavery, slave trading, the transition to legitimate commerce in tropical commodities, and women merchants. She has published numerous journal articles and book chapters in both Portuguese and English. Her book, Slave Trade and Abolition, Gender, Commerce, and Economic Transition in Luanda, was published in 2021 by the University of Wisconsin Press. Following, we have Rose Ndengue, a socio-historian and political scientist, Cameroonian scholar activist, who defines herself as a Black feminist from the transatlantic space straddling Africa, Europe, and the Americas. She is currently assistant professor in the Department of Social and Global Studies at Glendon, York University, where she is developing a teaching program in African studies and Black feminism from post-colonial and decolonial framework. Her research focuses on gender in politics in Africa and in the diaspora, in colonial and post-colonial contexts, with a particular emphasis on African and Afro-descendant women's mobilization in Cameroonian and French contexts. She is currently working on a book project in French entitled Incivilité subalterne, les mobilisations des Camerounaises et la pensée féministe noire. Ah, we got some bilingualism going on. Yeah.
We're presenting in French.
Following, we have Husseina Dinani. She is an assistant professor in the departments of Historical and Cultural Studies and Global Development Studies at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. At UTSC, Husseina teaches undergraduate courses in history and women's and gender study, African study, and international development studies. Husseina is currently preparing a book manuscript tentatively entitled Women of the Colony, Gender and Resourcelessness in Southeastern Tanzania. The manuscript examined the decolonization period in southeastern Tanzania from the perspective of gender and rural women. She has published aspects of this research in the International Journal of African Historical Studies and Gender and History. Husseina research interests also focus on labor in the colonial state in Tanzania and East African, South Asian, and Tanzania and Canada. So many books to buy soon. Finally,
Soon? I don't know.
so
One day.
soon is generous in academia.
But it's just been said out loud. I
have
no.
kept for these books. And finally, we have Annie Bunting. She is a professor of law and society and York Research Chair in International Gender Justice and Peace Building. Her research includes socio-legal studies of marriage and childhood, feminist international law and culture, religion and law. From 2010 to 2022, she directed an international research collaboration, a SSHRC-funded partnership from 2015 to 2022, called Conjugal Slavery in War, Partnership for the Study of Enslavement, Marriage, and Masculinities, with historians of slavery, community-based researchers, and women human rights scholars. She is the co-editor of Marriage by Force, Contestation over Consent and Coercion in Africa, with Benjamin Lawrence and Richard Roberts. Contemporary Slavery, Popular Rhetoric and Political Practice, with Joel Kirk, and Research as More Than Extraction, Knowledge Production and Sexual Violence in Post-Conflict Africa Society, with Alan Kikonko and Joel Kirk. Please help me in welcoming our lovely panelists. Pass the mic.
Oh, okay. Oh, I supposed to though. Okay. So I've been designed to moderate space, and I will try to do my best to moderate it in a good way. First of all, I want to, we all want to say that this roundtable was planned to take place in the previous cast at McGill last summer, but we decided to withdraw from the event in solidarity with pro-Palestinian encampment that was taking place there as a part of our feminist solidarity practice against the Israeli genocide, on the ongoing Israeli genocide against the Palestinians. So we are very happy to have the roundtable here at Harriet Tubman Institute, and it embodies also Black women resistance, right? So the four presentation you will have today, so including mine, are building around trying to answer two questions. The first one is, what are the possibility and constraint of researching and writing about African women? And the second one is, how can the inclusion of studies or research about African women change the epistemological and pedagogical canon of African studies? So to answer to this question, we will start with Husseina's presentation, and then we'll follow Vanessa, then mine, and we will conclude with Annie. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rose, for
We are not hearing Husseina.
Oh gosh. Hi. I heard a voice. Oh,
God can't hear you.
Can you?
Yeah.
I know you can hear me. Can you see me? But yeah, I truly remember the first time that I was here in person, and it was such a generative and productive space. So it's just such a pleasure for me to be here again, and to be here in person, because I was then only able to join remotely for a few years. So that's wonderful. And I want to thank my co-roundtable people for being here and for sticking with this idea. Yeah, so I'll perhaps try and address both the questions together. I don't necessarily have an order, so somewhere in what I say, I hope I am talking about both the possibilities and the constraints when it comes to researching and writing about women in Africa. I know that we say African women, but I'm going to try use women in Africa, because I think that sort of expands the scope of what we can actually who our actors are, as well as perhaps various other power dynamics that are at play as well. And then sort of maybe provide some brief insights into what I think would be, ways forward, particularly in terms of new insights that we can bring to bear, both not just in terms of knowledge production, but also in terms of teaching about women in Africa and African studies, as a result. So I'll just maybe start off by saying a little bit about my sort of research trajectory as I began researching about rural women in southeastern Tanzania. So I was very focused in understanding what their perspectives were of the late colonial period, as well as the post-independence period in Tanzania. And southeastern Tanzania was a particular focus because it was an extremely impoverished and remote area of Tanganyika territory, as it was called under British rule, continued to be that way also in the post-colonial period, and then was the focus of the radical politics of Ujamaa, or African socialism, under the leadership of Julius Nyerere. And a lot of those initiatives, particularly the resettlement program, adult education, various sort of nation-building initiatives, were heavily focused in this remote area of southeastern Tanzania. And, so I started off like any other graduate student, with the archive, right? And over here, the archive very much was state archives, colonial documents from the colonial period, documents from the post-independence period that are housed at the Tanzania National Archives, the main branch, which is in Dar es Salaam. But then I also looked at the holdings that they had at the Dodoma branch, which is where the capital is. And it became extremely clear to me right away that there's going to be a very difficult, if I were to resort to just using these documentary sources, I'm not necessarily going to have a very good idea of how rural women, predominantly illiterate at that time and continue, and a very large population still are today, to have a sense of just exactly how they perceived their lives under colonial rule, particularly the late colonial period, and then their engagement with the post-independence state. A lot of the sources, they're predominantly authored by men, particularly colonial and local administrators. Some of them were commercial employers, plantation owners, particularly from the sisal industry that was very dominant in the southeast of Tanzania. A lot of the focus in these documents were predominantly androcentric concerns, even in terms of the spaces, or this sort of attention that was being paid, was things like the plantations, right, or commercial industries, native authority councils, courts, local, regional, and national concerns about economics and politics, right? The dynamics between administrators in the central government located in Dar es Salaam and those located on the ground. So a lot of, not just in terms of what I was reading about, but also in terms of the type of actual spaces that were appearing in these documents were extremely androcentric. And if there were mentions of rural women, they were very brief, they were hollow, they were episodic. The files also projected this colonial understanding, or what I am labeling as a colonial understanding of Southeasterners' gender relations, right? And so for some sort of prominent tropes that I was seeing was that women from particularly the ethnic groups of the Mwera community, that heavily populated one of the districts that I conducted oral interviews in, which is Lindi, but then also the Makonde ethnic group, they were often portrayed as either victims of spousal patriarchy, or as deviant women transgressing societal gender roles. So court records that sort of looked at marital disputes, very much either labeled women as those who were runaway wives, perhaps engaged in illicit marital relationships, or if there was labor officers who were talking about the men who are working as laborers are perhaps either characterizing, not directly, but indirectly by calling the men unproductive and lazy and having not necessarily remunerating, remitting money back. They're sort of characterizing women in their households as being subjected to laggard, unproductive men, right? And so women were appearing in these documents, but they were appearing very much refracted through this colonial androcentric sort of gaze, right? And they could only really appear in certain tropes that were emerging. The files from the post-independence period were of a similar nature. Although there were more sources that were directly focusing on women, again, there was a very androcentric framework, very much one that was tied to the post-colonial government's nation-building agenda, that was very much grounded in this notion of African socialism, or Ujamaa. Women were categorized either as being these rural, and particularly rural women, because the African Ujamaa project was very much focused on the rural countryside. So rural women were characterized either as exemplary mothers, and also and therefore exemplary citizens, or they were not characterized as being that, right? State newspapers that interviewed rural women had, big features about rural women, not just in the Southeast, but, elsewhere in the country. The discourse that I've seen repeatedly was one where it was, if you're uplifting what the women were doing, rural women, it was almost done as a way to sort of shame the men for not doing the same, right? There was this very big urge that the Tanzanian government had, which was to get all able bodies to work on these cooperative farms. And so women were not just being, so they were almost used as a framework to sort of, call men into action as well. And you can sort of see that in the rhetoric. But so these were some of the challenges or some of the sort of, narratives that I was seeing. But at the same time, it was possible for me to work with these sources because to truly perhaps maybe find out what was happening at the broader level of gender dynamics, right? And so as I'm listening to the sort of the looking through the court records, even though they're framing women in as either deviant or as subordinated to patriarchy, it is sort of giving me an indication from the statistics of how many cases are based on marital disputes. It's telling me that something's happening in households and something is happening in the relations between men and women, right? So you can read these sources and sort of apprehend or take or extract from them nuggets of information that can be very valuable in allowing you to have a broader idea of sort of the gender dynamics and changes that are taking place. So I can say a lot more to give you examples of some of the other documents and how they could be read. I mean, if the Tanzanian newspapers in the post-colonial period, they were offering valuable information in terms of letting me know that there was robust engagement by women in Tanzania into some of these nation building initiatives. Now, whether women were doing it willingly or not is questionable if we were just to sort of look at those sources, but they are telling us that there were a lot of women at these sites, right? At these state demarcated sites. And so there was information that was telling me about women, even though it wasn't necessarily doing it in a way that might sort of evoke or convey their thoughts and their perceptions. So I didn't discard these documents and what I was finding from them. And I hadn't figured all these nuggets of valuable information or pinpointed them before at the very get-go. But I did start conducting interviews with women in southeastern Tanzania. And in many ways over here, I want to sort of make the case that I was perhaps part of a process of building an archive, right? And oral histories and oral interviews and oral methodologies can allow you to do that, right? They can allow you to build an archive. And this archive, of course, is not one that cements women's perceptions in a particular, so that it can speak even about that time period in the past 20 years from now. But from that particular context of 2010, when I was first conducting these interviews, didn't realize at the time, but we were building an archive collectively, right? And so using, it was semi-structured interviews. I asked women particular questions about their biographical information. I covered key critical events in the country's sort of political history. So, wanted to cover a few questions about independence and then the resettlement program, and then whether or not they were participating in adult education and various nation building initiatives. And I realized in retrospect that I was very much following an androcentric political trajectory, right? But when I went back to listening to a lot of the interviews, what I noted is that women were establishing their own critical events, right? Because they would sort of talk about critical events in their history, such as when they got married, right? And so that spurs what else was happening around there in their locale, when they gave birth to their first child, when a child passed away, when several children passed away, when they entered their second marriage or their fourth marriage, or for some their eighth marriage. In this part of rural Tanzania, elsewhere I've sort of written about serial monogamy that women were engaged in, and so they were establishing their own narrative and their own linearity that wasn't necessarily one that was even matching some of the questions that I was asking them. And so very quickly, as I started conducting interviews, my questions changed based on what I was hearing. And what became one of my first questions was, how many times have you been married? Because it became very clear that women had been entering and re-entering into marriage multiple times. And you know, and that very much changed how I thought my project about what the stuff of decolonization, what I thought it was, changed dramatically. And a lot of the book project is talking about marriage and gender relations and and what it means to be mobile from a gendered lens as you enter into a marriage, ask for divorce, go back to a kin's home, and then re-enter, all while there is an expanding wage labor market that is taking men in and shaping their mobility in different ways, right? Which is a lot more charted out, not just in terms of the documents, but not just in terms of scholarship, but also quite literally in terms of the roads that were being built, right? And so women in many ways were not just building their own roads as they were talking to me about their past, but you know, they were actually physically traversing and creating their own roads as they were sort of being mobile, gendered actors, right? And so, yikes. Okay, and so what I guess what I will offer is to say that putting beside, juxtaposing these different archives that very much have overlaps but have different fundamental differences has allowed me to really sort of obtain a deeper understanding of the gender dynamics that really is the story of decolonization in many ways in this part of Tanzania, and that women's, in a way that also can very much ground or foreground women's voices and their actions, beyond even just the words that they were sharing with me, right? And I think that I'm able to do because I'm not dismissing one archive to say that because it doesn't include their voices or it has these gazes, you know, that they aren't valuable, but I think working with them together. And so I'll just very quickly sort of say, you know, and I can talk a little bit more about this if it comes up in the Q&A session, and perhaps some of you might bring it up. But just to get to the second question, and, you know, here I'm really going to be drawing on G.E. Idahosa's call, which is to say that if we were to really if we were to change our approach to women and gender studies, and so not just studies that are focused on African women, right? What I see the value that that studies about African women can bring, not just to scholarship, but also within the classroom. She makes the case that it's both a decolonizing project, right? Which is to perhaps undo or pinpoint exactly sort of the harms that have taken place in the ways in which African women in particular have been represented in the canon, and to engage with that, to expose that, to point out the limitations. And in that way, it is a decolonizing project, but that also, that in that way that the project, and that the project needs to be decolonized, right? Which is then to sort of talk about what it then means to center African women, right? And then to sort of say how that then allows us to talk about decolonization, or to talk about the politics of nation building, or even sort of the impact of colonialism. But I can say more about all of that later. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Husseina, for this very rich presentation. And now I'm like, oh, I think my presentation is kind of a little bit too much general, but I think I see how we can bridge all of this. So, Vanessa.
Okay, so 2 years of pandemic, and we are still learning to deal with the technology. I hope the people online can hear me. Hi everyone. It's great to be back here. I met Rebecca today and I was telling her that I was associated to the Harriet Tubman Institute. I did my PhD here in York. So for me, this is like a homecoming. This place is very familiar to me, and it's nice seeing some familiar faces here, some of my friends, and getting to know new people as well. But I'm not going to talk too much, as you know, much about my research, and I'm glad I'm glad Husseina did. I'm going more like a broader approach to it, but I also get to my field. My research itself looks at women merchants and the transition from slave trading to legitimate commerce in tropical commodities in West Central Africa, particularly in the region that corresponds to modern day Angola. And I'll talk a little bit about the field of women in Africa, but thinking also like more about Angola. I was not sure how familiar the audience would be with African history, so I thought about maybe starting about talking a little bit about African history and how women becomes or is incorporated as a category of analysis in the field. But before that, I would like to thank Dr. Dinani, who is the mind behind this panel. As Dr. Nigoni said at the very beginning, initially, our plan was to have this panel at the CAS conference, but we dropped out in solidarity to the student encampment as well as the faculty of law strike that was going on at the time. And I'm happy that we are having this conversation at this place today. So, African history is a young discipline, as many of you might know, that African history became an academic discipline in the 1960s. However, women as a category of analysis was not incorporated into the discipline until the late 1970s. So this is about 2 decades after the very beginning of African history as an academic discipline. Prior to the early 1980s, African historians were mainly interested in recovering the history of great kingdoms and states. And they also later on in the 70s, they were very much interested in class struggles and how colonialism had impacted African societies. And in this historiography, women would show up only as queens and prostitutes, mostly, right? So if the women was related to the king, and then we have the whole historiography on queen mothers, for example, in West Africa. That's part of this early scholarship. But again, this was not research that was exclusively focusing on African women, right? It was focusing on the kingdoms and the states, and women would show up as these queens and queen mothers. So in the late 1970s and the early 1980s, this is when we see the publication of the first collections dedicated exclusively to women, right? And here I need to mention Women in Africa, edited by Nancy Hefkin and Edna Bay. That was published in 1976, and some of you might be familiar with this book, right? And also Women in Slavery in Africa, that was edited by Claire Robertson and Martin Klein in 1983, right? So these were perhaps the two first collections exclusively dedicated to the experiences of women. So this new scholarship resulted from this change of focus in the discipline, moving away from more like political and economic history to focus on social history, right? And by focusing on social history, then we have the emergence of a scholarship that will focus on marginalized subjects such as women, criminals, and the enslaved, right? And now I'm going to move into my area of research, right? Angola. So in the case of Angola, the first studies focusing on women also dates from the 1980s, right? And it's interesting because this is also when we see more women entering the field, studying Angolan history, right? And these women, they will then bring the subject to the table to discuss the experiences of women. I'm sure this might be familiar to other areas of the continent as well. And then when we look from the 1980s to the present, there are some themes that emerge in the history of women in Angola. And I'll talk about some of these two themes, right? But one of the maybe not the most important, but the one that got a lot of attention was Queen Nzinga, right? And you might be familiar with Queen Nzinga, but she became a symbol of nationalism for Angola people and also for the nation for her fight against Portuguese occupation in the 17th century. But she was elevated to this place of symbol of the nation. If you visit Angola, especially Luanda, the capital of Angola, you see several statues of Queen Nzinga. And then we have this historiography that has focused on Queen Nzinga. For example, just to mention some people here, Joseph Miller, John Thornton, Brazilian historian Selma Pantoja, Marina de Mello Souza, and Mariana Brax more recently, but also Angolan and Portuguese historians, Inocência da Mata, Carlos Almeida, and more recently in 2017, Linda Haywood published a biography of Queen Nzinga. And this historiography is very extensive. I can't even like cover the name of everybody who has studied Nzinga. But we also have another like theme that's very important in this historiography are the studies on the donors. Donors are merchant women that mastered Portuguese culture, European culture. They often married European men. And these women, they were traders, right? They were trading in foodstuffs, they were trading imported goods. But there were also some of them, those who had access to more capital, were also trading enslaved people, right? So some of these women, they were enslaved traders. Many of them, they made the fortune through their participation in the transatlantic slave trade. So in this field, like the history of the donors, we have the pioneer work of Brazilian historian Selma Pantoja. We have my work as well for Luanda. And we have the work of Mariana Candido and Jose Curto, a York University professor for Benguela, right? That's just the port city south of Luanda. And then we have studies on the degradadas or exile criminals and women that were who are caught by the Portuguese Inquisition. So here we have Roquinaldo Ferreira and Kali Cananonja, who have been looking at these processes from the Portuguese Inquisition. And this has generated a very prolific scholarship. And then more recently, another very important theme is the women combatants, right? Or women who engaged in the nationalist movements as well as in the civil wars. And I don't like to talk about women combatants because the participation of women in these events goes beyond engaging in the war front, right? There was women who were producing food to, feed the soldiers. So they were not part of the combatant group, but they were still very much engaged in this war, and their role they play what was essential for maintaining the health of those men in the front, right, in the war front. So here I can mention Margarida Paredes, who is an Angolan historian, but also Marisa Grassi, Marisa Mormon, that some of you might know, Cesalina Abreu, and others. And another topic that became very emergent in this scholarship is the literature on the zungueiras. Zungueiras were basically street vendors. So these are women who sell goods and food stuff on the streets. And we also have a very important scholarship looking at these women. But we also have some gaps, right? And I'd like to take some time to think about the gaps here. A very important one is in terms of class. If you pay attention in the themes that I was describing before, you might have noticed that much of this historiography deals with elite women, whether we are talking about queens in there or we are talking about the donors, right? These are elite women. Ordinary women didn't occupy these these kinds of positions, right? So we need more work that look at ordinary women, enslaved women. We do have some people looking at enslaved women. Myself, Mariana Candido has also written about enslaved women, Joseph Curdo, but we need to know more about the experiences of ordinary women. Another issue is that most studies focus on urban areas. So we know more about the experiences of women living in these port cities, such as Luanda and Benguela, and we know very little about interior areas. Even though some of us are not pushing into the interior, our research to expand into the interior, but we know less about the interior areas generally, and specifically about rural women, right? That was the backbone of this society, right? Those women, they were producing food to supply urban markets. So we need to know more about the experiences of these women because agricultural work was women's work, right? Another issue is that we know very little regarding the period before the 18th century, because most of the research focus, especially in the 19th century or in contemporary issues, and it creates that crisis that some historians call like the crisis of presentism, because people read about the experiences of women in the 20th century, in the 19th century, and they tended to project this to the more distant past, right? Without trying to understand how events such as colonialism, the civil wars impacted the experience of those women and how they changed over time, right? Another issue is also that we need to understand better how systems such as colonialism, the wars of liberation, and the civil wars impacted women and girls. So what are the possibilities, right? When we think about the possibilities, I think it would not be an exaggeration to say that Angola holds one of the largest collection of archival documentation in sub-Saharan Africa. The amount of documentation that you can find in Angola is just incredible. And a lot of this documentation is not even available because it's not treated, right? I think with exception of South Africa, Angola possibly has the largest archival documentation. And women are everywhere in this documentation, right? So they show up in the documentation as merchants, as wives, as petty traders, cultural broker, as slaves, right? As street vendors. So they are everywhere. So the possibilities of research on women are endless, right? Of course, there are constraints. Angola is a very expensive place, as you might know. Luanda itself has been placed in the list of most expensive cities in the world a few times, right? Um, Angola can also be very difficult to navigate. There is a heavy bureaucracy, including the archives, and I can expand on that later on if anyone is interested in this case we'll discuss that. Another issue is that I do archival research, right? Because I work on the 19th century. As Husseina has mentioned, when she was talking about the archives, most of the archival documentation were written by Europeans, right? Especially by European men. it impacts very heavily in how we see women in those sources. And we have to be of them, right, when we are looking at those sources. And then just to finish, and maybe we can talk more through the research and bringing back here for my time period, that is in the 19th century. Right? So in the 19th century, women made up the majority of the population in both major cities in Rwanda, whether we are talking about Rwanda or Benguela. So women were the majority of the population. In Rwanda, at some point by the mid 19th century, women made up 60% of the population. Women were also the main labor force in the rural areas, right? They were producing the food that supplied the urban markets. So, therefore, any history that doesn't take into consideration the experiences of women is partial history, right? Because basically, like 60% of the population. And I feel like, I'm finishing. Sorry, I'm able to. Anyway, we can no longer use the excuse that there are no primary sources to write the history of women. That's not true, right? One has to go to the archive and they come back of that and say, okay, I didn't find anything. And I promise you, you will find some because women are everywhere in this document. So there is no longer an excuse to write a history of any place that doesn't include the experience of women. And I stop. Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. And I will follow up your conclusion because this is where I start, like this idea of having these excuses of not um, writing women history or not including women in history because you don't have sources. And in my presentation, I will kind of talk about like my experience through PhDing a few years ago. When I started my research, my main concern was how to make Cameroonian women from colonial and post-colonial era voices heard. Is it even possible? Because when I started my research, I had all these idea on gender and women history in general, which is it's very difficult because you don't have these sources, these archival sources that are considered as classical way to do history, right? So this broad question leads me to a range of issue, and I will explore quickly very general three of them. Like is it possible to write a political history of women? Because I was coming from poli-sci and then I started doing a PhD in history. So what was important for me was this political aspect of women history. How, what sources, what methodology, and at the end, the result, what are the implications of writing the history, doing this research for epistemology, but also in terms of political result. So in terms of the first question about like, is it possible to write an history or political history of Cameroonian women and even be crazy to make it mainstream, right? So I will start like just confirm what Husseina said, Vanessa, the fact that women or gender issue in colonial and post-colonial history, historiography in Africa or everywhere is still marginal in mainstream historiography. So there's also the case in Cameroonian historiography. There are some effort that has been made to think and analyze the social space and the political space in Cameroon in light of gender dynamic. There are some Cameroonian and non-Cameroonian scholars like Emmanuel Condé, Meredith Tereta, Jacqueline Betel-Chutamugwe, my own work, etc. But despite this kind of growing, because we have kind of growing body of work, mainstream studies on Cameroonian politics remain androcentric. So I was wondering when I started my PhD, it was like, is this marginalization translate any great difficulty on accessing sources like being archived or even women, right? Especially because I came to gender studies through the Western lens of women and gender studies. In France, where you have this very famous historian, female historian, Michel Perrault, who was inviting us to develop her story, so history of women, by taking some detours, by example, by focusing on sources in a different way. And I think like the presentation of Husseina, I show how you still find women in Androcentric archives. So reading, she was inviting us to reading sources differently, and even consider going beyond the classical archive, a classical source, and using non-conventional archives or sources. So while acknowledging the validity of this consideration that have been also shown here, my case of study shows that sometimes the erasure of women, I mean, it confirmed that the erasure of women from history is really the manifestation of an assertive androcentric bias or choice. You can put it as you want. I will say choice because I am a feminist and I like to be provocative, right? Which has ignored the important archives that do exist. Because archives exist, I have had a lot. I don't know. I think I have maybe like a picture of, I don't know how many thousand of pictures. And I'm not sure I haven't even used half of it for my PhD dissertation. So for me, I come to realize that the absence of women, Cameroonian women from historiography was not due to a lack of sources. If we talk about like the classical archives or the difficulty on accessing them, because, and then I come to my second point, what are the sources where can they be found? I have examined archives in Cameroon in three different sites: in National Archive in Yaoundé, in National Archive in Boya, because Cameroon is like Canada, we are bilingual, but there the minority is the Anglophone part. So I went there. And then the regional archive at Bafoussam, which is at the west. And in all those center of archives, I found women, even in androcentric archive, but even archives produced by women, right? So I was very moved by that because I realized that there are archives who have been produced either by authority, colonial or post-colonial, or by women themselves through their organization. And what was very interesting is the fact that women nationalist movement has produced a lot of archives, and through this archive you can see one of the category which always, like most of the time, missing rural women, because like one of my last article is about rural nationalist women organizing in a very, very tiny rural area in Cameroon called Babimbi. So I realized that you can find archives in different places in Cameroon, but you can also find archive in France. I found archive in two main sites, in Aix-en-Provence, Archives Nationales d'Outre-mer, and in Paris region, it's the archives, Archives départementales de Bobigny, who had a body of archive of nationalist movement. So as well as the classic written archives I also used autobiography written by women nationalists. In Cameroon, you have two women nationalist leaders who have wrote biography, Marthe Moumier and Marie-Reine Gampette-Billon. And I used oral sources. I think we all do at some point, like when we are working on contemporary news. So I've been able to meet and sometimes interview women nationalist militants from the 1950s. Now they are dead, they passed away, and the 1970s. I have also interviewed more contemporary news female politicians. And looking behind the access to the sources, I should also acknowledge that there are still challenges and constraints. One of the challenge in terms of archive, for example, it's the question of conservation for the archive who are in Cameroon, because I've been able to examine some archive that I'm quite sure they are not available today because they were in a poor condition, right? So you have all this thing about like you might be the last one to examine this archive. So the next social historian or political scientist who want to have access to this archive couldn't. So there is this constraint, and we can talk more about it later. There is also another challenge. It's about when you're doing oral history with women, there are some women who are unwillingly to share their experiences because some of them can feel they are not entitled to do so. So I face that. But also when you work on history of nationalist movement, because in Cameroon, to give you a small context, we have had an independence war which is still denied today against France, and then there is a lot of female militants who have been tortured, who went in exile, and so when you meet them, sometimes asking them to share their experience is asking them to revivify the trauma. So I had to deal with that, like how can I deal with that? And at this time, I also need to acknowledge that I wasn't really prepared. I didn't read any literature about like the decolonial approach and all these kind of things. So I was kind of crafting something from scratch and trying to kind of trust my gut. Like when my gut said, no, you let it go, I just let go. I remember one of the women, Jacqueline Kemayu, was being exiled in Ghana and tortured, and then she's a part of nationalist militants who have been arrested when there was this coup against Nkrumah, because Nkrumah has been very protective of African nationalist movement, and she has been jailed. And I went to see her 3 times, and 3 times she was like, I really can't. I'm sorry, because I cannot talk about that, because until today, still today, we are still kind of marginalized for the fight we fought. So I had to. I was sure that her experience was important, but at the same time, I was like, I need to respect the fact that she's unwilling to share this experience with me and with let's say those who will read my work. So so with all this, I managed to find some testimony archives, and I draft my PhD dissertation, and then comes the question about how, like, working on women, how centering on women have in epistemological, pedagogical, and political implication. What I discover is that Cameroonian women have been involved in a wide range of political activities since the introduction of what I call the modern colonial citizenship in Africa. So, for example, if you look at Cameroonian nationalist female movement, they have been able to develop a strong intersectional anti-colonial framework in the 1950s. And I also realized that these activities they had unfold both within the framework of modern institutions like association, NGO, political party, etc., that promote formal citizenship, but they will also mobilize indigenous forms of women political expression, which are more conducive to insurgent citizenship. What I call insurgent citizenship is this capacity we can observe on indigenous culture where women can express their anger, and they don't have to express it in a polite way. They can, they can beat men, they can destroy things, and all of this is totally legit and it's totally acceptable. So that's what I call insurgent citizenship. And so I realized that centering on women challenge both gender and also authoritarian colonial post-colonial order prevailing in Cameroon, and I'm quite sure like it's the same in the world continent. And I also saw that when you analyze the political action of Cameroonian women as of African women in general, you have to think beyond this dichotomy of domination and resistance, because the way they move in the space involve a kind of multifaceted agency involving resistance sometimes, but also the ability to embrace, exploit, and defy the norms. And another result of my research is how centering on women leads us to re-examine notions such as modernity. What does that mean, modernity, when this modernity is all built on male, right? Of citizenship, the modern citizenship, which is the being entitled to vote, all this kind of thing. Who have been, when he has been crafted, who was included in the beginning? Because who was included in the beginning and who was excluded in the beginning is still excluded today. We can say that through history. It's also about questioning the concept, the classical concept of political participation, because, for example, you'll say political participation is going to vote. So it's kind of institutional participation, right? But what I did is like centering on women, but more on mobilization than institutional part of women history. And then you can see that marching is a political participation. Women from northwest of Cameroon who are doing Anlu, which is indigenous protest, getting naked, I forgot her name, called naked, and Naminata Jabate called naked agency. It's a political participation because they are addressing, by doing that at this period, they were addressing question of agricultural policy, question of being entitled to vote, etc. So centering our analysis on women call into question the very foundations of our post-colonial state and the knowledge we are producing about them. So, and I would be very happy to dive more on some idea I have just thrown here, like generally during the Q&A. Thank you.
Yeah. I also want to acknowledge all of you and thank you for coming on this Thursday afternoon. And of course, to Bianca and Rebecca for putting the Tubman Talks together and this space that some of us have lived in longer than others. Yeah, I'm also really grateful actually to have the conversation here. It would have been great to have it at CAS, but I'm really glad that we're here. And I want to acknowledge my co-panelists because I'm very grateful to have this conversation. And I'm now thinking, why did they invite me to come? But I'll try and justify my existence. So, yeah, so I'm not an historian. So I'm the non-historian in the crowd, and my training is in law. And so I come at my feminist research from already starting with the qualitative research, and then I go to the archive as opposed to the other way around. So I wasn't going to talk about my own doctorate, but I'm just going to drop it in for some context, and you'll better understand how I come to some of the questions that I ask and some of the possibilities and constraints for feminist research in the area of socio-legal studies of international laws. So originally in the 1990s, when I was doing my doctorate in law, I was interested in the ways in which women's organizations in northern Nigeria were mobilizing international law in their very local struggles around early age at marriage. So I was looking at what was called child marriage, now called early child and forced marriage, in that context. And as you know, as people who study and follow the history and politics of Africa, northern Nigeria is predominantly Muslim. So there were large Federation of Muslim women's organizations that were involved in advocacy around early age at marriage, and in particular, the reproductive health consequences for young women of getting married young and therefore having children young. And it goes to the socioeconomic as well, because there was a lot of malnourishment. And so if you are not fully developed when you have your first child, it causes a lot of reproductive health negative consequences. But I was intrigued about why in that context, women's organizations might be looking to international women's rights as another tool in their strategizing for advocacy. This struck me as really sort of complicated, and also like why look to international law. And so I was interested also in the ways in which international women's rights resonated with colonial interventions. Of course, the colonial powers were very interested in marriage, age at marriage, quote unquote, native marriage. And so they were the ways in which feminists were mobilizing international human rights law was just the same ways that, of course, colonial administrators were articulating their concerns over marriage and justifying colonial intervention. And yet, women's organizations were still trying to use that as a strategy. So it was that kind of tension around international legal norms and women's advocacy that I found really interesting. And just as Rose was saying, I found I was looking to read sources differently and to look at different sources. And in that way, I went to fiction. So, which in law, wasn't necessarily the most popular source. So, you have to go to fiction, and then you go to archives, and then you go to fiction in the archives. And what we learn about the ways in which women are everywhere, even in the silences. And so you have to write also, I think, to those silences, and also and sort of think about also, of course, being so attentive as all of the previous speakers have said, to the colonial tropes, to the stereotypes, to the ways in which only particular versions of women are being presented as a predominance in records. And then also, interestingly, when I started to play with the historians, they're looking at legal archives. Colonial history is written through law, right? It's written. We're going, like, some of the largest archives are the courts, right? And that's often what we're talking about. And women go to courts, right? So that was those possibilities of going to different sources and working with civil society organizations and working in solidarity with women's groups was how I came to the field of African studies. And so the first thing that I think is interesting that follows sort of a line that we draw through from what we've been talking about in our panel is the importance of the archive, and then the feminist living archive, right? So when we don't necessarily, we have to both reread, we have to read with feminist eyes and with gender lenses. We read the archive, and then we read the silences, and then we supplement, right? And so then, and as I say, I come more from starting with the qualitative research and then going to the archive. I'm not trained in history. But I think the other thing that we share there is that, and again, this sounds like so kind of itself a trope, but looking for women's voices in different spaces. And I would say that my second preoccupation was trying to think about the ways of bringing women's experiences of everyday violence into our conversations about international law. So and again, I think the voices heard and trying to articulate some of the women's experiences that are not making it into more mainstream historiography, but also not necessarily making it into mainstream human rights reporting, not necessarily making it into mainstream socio-legal literature, right? So in my field as well, international law has a similar historiography as the other fields. And so there was a need, obviously, for not only a feminist international law intervention, but then you have to, and you said it so well, like then you have to actually decolonize the decolonizing project, right? And so that's a very complicated and ongoing process, obviously. So I actually want to spend, and I'm going to hopefully end closer to 10 minutes than 15, but I actually want to focus a little bit on the second question around the epistemological or conceptual possibilities that this work and all of your and our work together offers in terms of the space in African studies. And here, I think I would say I had 3 ideas that I wanted to share here. One is I think that doing this kind of feminist work in solidarity with African women, it offers us opportunities to rethink agency. And it's one of the main, I think it's one of the main contributions in feminist theory that we have seen over the past couple of decades. And I think that the work that I've been doing over the last dozen years is more working with women in post-conflict and sadly now also ongoing context of conflict in Eastern Congo or Liberia, Rwanda, and so on. And here, you know, again, when you are attentive to what women are actually saying or what they're not saying because they're choosing to be silent, as is great and needs to be respected, then I think that really attentive listening and feminist engagement allows us to think about a more complex agency, but also not to jump to what we did, I think, and I include myself, you know, sort of in the 80s and 90s in terms of a much more structural analysis that denied agency under certain conditions of oppression, right? So the nuancing of those, yes, we can keep our attention to the structures of oppression, histories of colonialism, ongoing racism, and patriarchy, but in there you have both tactical and strategic agency, and there's just ways in which to think and read the archive and women's experiences that is attentive to this much more nuanced exercise of agency that's not nearly so binary, and that even in conditions of abduction, because I have been working on issues around abduction for forced marriage in conflict situations. So even women who have been abducted and spent long periods of time in conditions of captivity, had children, raising their children, losing children, and returning, even in those conditions, you see extraordinary examples of negotiation, right? Like remarkable examples of strategic negotiations, you know, the whole thing. Anyway, so I think that when you foreground and try and do that kind of attentive listening, we learn a lot conceptually about nuancing agency. I think the second is, and this obviously is a more obvious example about harm, that conceptually we have in law in general and international criminal law in particular, the list of harms has not been gendered. It has only recently been gendered, but that is an ongoing process that, again, when you listen to the ways in which women articulate the harms that they have experienced, it actually pushes conceptually on the way that we think about harm. So, and it also thinks about a much more complex victimhood. So, and by that I mean that oftentimes, again, sometimes women will say, I don't want to be called a survivor, Annie. Like, I'm a victim of this. Like, this is, and I'm like, okay, got you. And, you know, I'm thinking I'm being all politically correct and using a survivor, but sometimes someone wants to be called a victim survivor, or sometimes they want to be called a victim because it entitles them to certain things and not others. And it's not, again, going back to agency, it's not necessarily an identity that denies their agency, but rather the opposite. It's like, this attaches me to this service, right? And so on. But again, when you're thinking about that it offers us opportunities to have a more sophisticated understanding of the ways in which people experience harm. and also what they consider to be an appropriate redress for that. So one of the things that we've found working with our partners in many countries is that if women have been abducted during school age and they come back with children, say 5 years later, and they're reintegrating into communities, they actually don't necessarily see the redress as being their own education. They're not articulate. They would like skills training and so on. The redress for the harm is maybe skills training and much more economic, small opportunities to build their small business and so on. It's all about education for their children. And we hear it time and time again. And in fact, we were just in Liberia in end of November, beginning of December, meeting with women and girls groups, and we heard it consistently across 5 places. And finally, of course, I think it has also to do with justice. I think I've said that, but also in my own work, there's a concept in socio-legal studies around legal pluralism, and I think that again, what feminist studies in and with African women in different contexts, at least in the post-conflict situations I work in, it also offers us an opportunity to nuance legal pluralism. And what do I mean by that? If you actually, again, are doing this work, it's like, then you see that women are themselves lawmaking. They are actually, they are making new norms. They are, through their negotiations and so on, they have an understanding what that harm is, and they're making a claim either at the state level or at the community level, or even in international law, to articulate a different sense of law, legal harms, and legal redress. So we found in another project that the way that women think about and seek justice also is actually very law-making from their perspective. And here, I think, again, it goes back to work around in feminist theories, but also just, you know, the work that I think everyone is doing in terms of trying to push against both the field. You know, you're pushing like both the field and other areas. And I'll just end with one story that brings me back to the archives and telling a more complete history by including women's voices, which was originally how I got into the work in post-conflict situations. Was a coalition on women's human rights in conflict situations that was monitoring the prosecution of gender crimes at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And years later, we were looking at this phenomenon of forced marriage in conflict situations. And our partner in Rwanda said, yeah, that happened here. And I found like an old reference to abduction where women were referred to as wives in a Africa Rights report, very, very early reporting after the genocide. Then it's dropped. It's nowhere for political reasons, obviously. And so then I'm working with Godlieve Mukasarasi, my colleague in Rwanda. We go to the archives in Kigali. We go to the genocide archives. I ask, oh, I'm interested, you know, we're interested in this. And they're like, it didn't happen. And I'm like, it didn't happen. We have none of that. I'm like, okay, that's interesting because actually Godlieve's been interviewing women for whom this happened. So but something's not right here. And so then it's like, and they pulled me like crazy stories in the archives. I listened to them for days, but they weren't the same stories. But again, it's one of those challenges in what we do, and you just have to trust your gut. And, you know, exactly, women are in the archives, and women's experiences will make themselves, you know, will tell a more complete history. So yeah, thanks.
Thank you all for your presentation, your brilliant presentation. I'm moderating, but I think we should open the floor to the question. I will just say that I think if there is something transversal on all these presentations we made today, is about plasticity, being able to have this plasticity when we are doing research, also about decentering, and even as a researcher, decentering on our own expectation. And also being able with this plasticity and ability to decenter, to accept, to acknowledge the plurality and to dive in this plurality. So the floor is yours for the question. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That was a lovely panel. This piece of paper is not big enough for all my scribbles. I really liked in different ways that you articulated a form of listening to the archive and listening to the voice of women, but not in that like weird second wavy feminist way, but like, you know what I mean? But in a way that really what I was hearing from all of you, there's like a humility to that, doing that type of research. And so I guess because time's a constraint, we never really got to the second part of the second question, but I'm really interested in how what I'm calling this like feminist humility or even decolonial humility to sort of look at these stories and find them in a particular way, how that affects your pedagogical outlook. Like, how do you teach with that in mind? How does that help you frame some of your students' idea, you know, in um, multicultural Canada, whatnot? Like, what does that do? What does that do in teaching in other spaces? Yeah, so I'm just really curious on how that very, uh, I would say, personal experience, right, resonates in your teaching. Yeah.
I don't know how you want to go about it, but yeah, maybe we can take more questions.
Oh,
Thank you for such a brilliant presentation. I think I'm becoming so feminized in my mindset. Yeah, just listening here. This is a good support across different everyone. You know, a general theme that emerged in your presentation is one in which that captures speculation or running with opinion. And I'm going to draw from Hartman about critical fabulation. And I do wonder, how far can you go in terms of speculating and maybe getting into maybe I would say inductive or deductive, which is the one. I'm getting old now, you know, I'm confused. Inductive reasoning, and not slipping down that slope where you're committing some fallacy. How far can you go in speculating when you see an absence of presence, but it's there, but then it's like it's not fully accounted for empirically by fact, but at the same time you can speculate. You can actually create an opinion and actually move beyond the absence there. But my question is, or simply put, and how far can you go without not committing academic suicide? Thank you.
anybody else? Come to you.
Thank you. That was very illuminating. So thank you. So a couple of questions. One is specific to Tanzania, and that's if you can just talk about the independence, because I know there were two independences or something. You can just like, because and how women were part of that movement, and how much of their agency was part of that independence, right? That's one. And then two, and this is for kind of the general table, is this idea of illiteracy. And I'm kind of questioning that term. So I just wanted to just put it out there. That's it.
Great presentation, by the way, very, like he said, illuminating. I think that you guys all touched upon the archives and the challenges of going there and seeking information. I'm just curious about what you guys think about digital archives. Has it made research easier? Does it pose additional challenges, especially when we focus on women? Just kind of curious on your experience with digital archives, if any, and what you think about it.
And just because I have the mic and just following that question, I was thinking about because you were also talking about the deterioration of archives, and I was wondering if there is like a digitization of these archives that is happening, or even microfiche like digitization, like if we don't have the technology of preserving those archives. Mm.
Okay, I'm gonna read my question because I had to write it down. So I work with fiction a lot, and I'm asking this question because you brought up fiction. The fiction genre has played a crucial role in capturing African women's historical development, challenges, and struggles, often filling gaps left by conventional records. However, given its inherent subjectivity and creative liberties, can fiction be considered a reliable primary source for research? To what extent does its ability to present multiple perspectives compensate for its lack of empirical validation? Last question, how should researchers critically engage with fiction alongside archival research, which offers historical documentation, but may also be shaped by biases, omissions, and institutional gatekeeping? Thank you.
Can you get the last question there?
Sorry, I thought I didn't see all
No, it's okay. It's okay. Thank you. Yeah,
Conversation.
yeah. Thank you. I think those were very brilliant and very illuminating presentations. I have to really thank you guys. A couple of questions, but I'll probably just limit myself to about two. And one of my questions, I think, ties to what Charlie spoke about. Yes, thank you for whatever it is. And this regards how, in your contemporary desire to, of course, historicize women in that case, how are you dealing with the issue of a powerful woman? Okay, because literary, rather history.
What's the word? Sorry.
Powerful woman.
Powerful women. Okay.
Yes, because in my interaction with a number of historical work, you seem to really get these examples very prominent. And I think there are a number like Mekatilili Wameza in Kenya, that is among the Giriama. We have today, I think I did my research in life, and I see a lot of powerful women, especially in terms of women as healers, women as prophetesses today. We even see in my community a burial cannot proceed if a married man is to be buried and the wife is not there. They have to wait for the woman to come. That tells me that we have symbols and expressions of very powerful women, okay, and what they have done. So my question then is, and I would want to understand how the current historical stories, for example, are trying to deal with such kind of experiences. And two is, I am wondering whether the historical method in trying to understand the position and the space of the woman, and so much reliance on the archives, which I think is a very rich historical methodology. But I'm just asking myself whether we find whether those kind of methods are in a way limiting the journey of history. I don't know. I'm just thinking aloud. Thank you. But I would have wished to ask us many more questions. But
Thank you. I get some questions.
Last but not least, I hope. I was in class, so I missed half the presentation, but from what I heard, very enlightening, very empowering panel. So thank you for being here. I'm the undergraduate representative of the Tubman Committee, and I always think it's such a blessing that I get to be in this position of just being engrossed with such enlightenment and education. So thank you. I guess my question is, especially from where I'm sitting, about to embark hopefully on some research in the future, is just lessons learned. Again, if you could talk to your younger self, what would you tell your younger self about the path forward? some of the pitfalls along the way, but obviously within pitfalls, there's also opportunities for enlightenment of your own. So just quickly, anybody can just talk about some lessons that they've learned along the way. That'd be great. Thank you.
All right, lots of questions for y'all.
Okay. I think maybe we'll, in the interest of time, we'll each take one question that was either directed toward us or inspired us. So we'll try that, and then happy to have ongoing conversations with everyone. So in terms of lessons learned, Clifton, thank you for the question. One would be take a methods class, because I was in the law faculty, and you don't do a methods class. Maybe they do now, but back in the day they didn't. And so a lot of us, I think, would tell you that we learned a bit on the fly, which isn't all bad, but it may not have been the best for some of my first participants in the interviewing and so on. Fortunately, I also worked with a brilliant social worker in those early interviews. And so my other lesson learned is always, work in collaboration and, respect those relationships of collaboration. And then I know I said answer only one, but now I'm going to go for two. Oh dear. Yeah, no, we're always rebellious. Yeah, that's one thing. So I was the fiction point and empirical, the tension between empiricism, creativity, and so on. And Shireen Razak, who's a critical race scholar in Canada, it was on my committee, and I remember her at one point like totally shaking me to the bone when she said, "Well, how do you know they were even telling you the truth?" And I was like, "What? I'm a feminist. I assume they're telling me the truth. Women tell me the truth." And I'm like, "Oh yeah, right." And I said, "But it doesn't matter, actually," which then makes my students very upset. But I'm sure I've even said it in class that I don't care whether they're telling me the truth. But because the thing is that it's part of a narrative construction, which is also true in fiction. So I'm very interested in that narrative construction. And that narrative construction can also tell us about social expectations. It can tell us about relationships. It can tell us about community expectations and so on. So fiction doesn't need to be elevated. I can't put it in court, obviously, but it can resonate with other narratives in popular discourse, in what you're hearing and so on. So obviously, I'm also trained in law, so sometimes things need to be verified for the purposes of a case and so on. But yeah, memoir, I worked with memoir. Are memoir actually fiction, or are they, right? They're nonfiction, right? But we all know about memory, that memory, you ask your sibling to tell the same story about the same family event, and the story may be narrated quite differently. So I'm interested, like that's like a creative tension, but yeah, so I agree with you. It's tricky. And then the other thing I would say is that researchers are very bad at sharing their archive. And I'll just leave you with that.
Well, I'll address the questions on Tanzania, and then depending on time, if I should pick another. Yeah, I mean, when you say two independences, so there's mainland Tanzania, which gained independence from the British in 1961, December 9th. And then there was the union of the mainland with the islands of Zanzibar. And so that was in April 1964, and that's when you have the United Republic of Tanzania. So that's when Tanzania comes about. So with the southeast of Tanzania, which is on the mainland, the area that I sort of look at, so this is where it was. So the area was so remote, and that the road conditions were so bad during the colonial period. This was referred to as the punishment station. Yeah, if you were a colonial administrator and you were stationed in what was called the Southern Province at the time, it was called a punishment station. For over half the year, sometimes the region was totally disconnected from the rest of the country, because there's sort of two seasons, right? Anyway, this is just simply to answer the question that a lot of women and a lot of people were not at the forefront of engaging in the nationalist movement. at the time, which is not to say that it didn't, that the TANU, which was the party that Julius Nyerere was leading, did not reach the southern province. It did, but not as expansively and extensively as it did in other parts of Tanzania. And a lot of that has to do with the structural impoverishment of southern Tanzania. And yeah, when I used the term illiterate, it was just specifically in the context of saying when we think about documentary and what gets written down and preserved, it was just sort of in that. But of course, women are literate, right? Women are literate in all kinds of ways. And to sort of, you know, I was using it in the context almost to say that the reading and the writing, but you have literacy in all genres and all types, right? And that's precisely what women were doing, was being literate with me when they were talking about their past, talking in many ways about their present circumstances, when they were bringing out various material objects that they had. And that's something else that I probably should mention, is the value of material objects, and not the embedded memory so much, but also the embedded meanings, yeah, that are in these material objects and what they actually can do in terms of spurring, you know, various sort of narratives as well. And so that very much came about. Clothing was actually mentioned a lot in terms of the scarcity of clothing during the colonial period, but it was framed in a way as men not fulfilling their marital obligations of providing sufficient clothing. And that came about precisely because, you know, one of the interviewees would look at me and she said, well, you know, you weren't wearing this yesterday. You see, you have all of these clothes. I, on the other hand, he only gave me right. And so there was, it tells you a lot about also the types of interactions, you know, in many ways I was being viewed as a younger girl, you know, who was unmarried at the time. She's like, oh, you're married? No. So you know, that was built into that dynamic of the interview. So yeah, should I take another, or I'm happy to pass on, or? Yeah, maybe I'll just go to critical fabulation, Sarah Hartman. And I feel like I do this in, you know, so the colonial documents give me a sense of how terrible the road networks and the sort of communications infrastructure were in Southern Province, but then also in the post-colonial period. But when women were sort of telling me how when they demanded a divorce and they took their very few belongings, I took my clothes, I took my 2 pots that I had, and, you know, I put them up and I started walking. So when I sort of, I somewhere in one piece of writing, I sort of talk about, based on what I know of the poor road connections, but that they only fed the pathways that men would take. But women are not taking these pathways as they're reaching a kin's home. I sort of thought about what that meant in terms of their journey. So I do sort of bring that up enough to sort of say, you know, they're itinerant, and in many ways they're practicing a gendered form of migrant labor, very you know, not necessarily the way in which we think of migrant labor, which is when men sort of leave home to go to the plantations, but what that journey actually felt like and looked like, knowing that even amidst the poor infrastructure, women were sort of creating their own pathways, and what it means to carry your load, you know. Yeah, so I do tread in that way. Yeah, but I will just say there is a book by Clifton Crace and Pamela Scully. It's Sarah Bartman, A Ghost Story, I think. And, you know, they try to sort of recreate who this person was before she became known as the Hottentot Venus, and they sort of employ, you know, much of this sort of methodology as much as they can. They said, well, she must have obviously gone down this pathway and washed clothes with all the other women in this area, because we know she lived in this area. And again, you know, so they try to sort of bring that out. And in many ways, I try to sort of try and think of what it actually meant to live like them in that time period, obviously guided by the sources that I have, right? So, but a lot more to do there.
Okay, that's the plant growth. Okay. Yeah. I'm gonna start with the I will start to wrap up like 2-3 questions, but I will start with the question of Bianca about the feminist humility and how it affects the pedagogical framework in my class. I think you should ask my student, but because I say things about how I behave with my students, and I'm like, I'm not sure they will confirm. But I think it's kind of enabled me to be also humble in my class, in the sense that making space and room for my student experience and allowing this experience to shatter the way I have taught things and this kind of thing, like having this kind of room of not being rigid and being like open to be moved by student experience, and then that the student experience kind of make me reframe things, all this kind of stuff. So that's kind of ongoing work, which also asks you to do work with yourself, right? Because we all have like these bias or things we are holding on. So this is the part of the pedagogical framework. But I want to get back to this question of fiction and history, and it's really interesting because last semester I was teaching a class Histoire et Fiction en français, which is history and fiction. And what we have, it was my first time to teach that, to be honest. And what we have all discovered with my student is like archives are fictions. Yeah, I know that it can be very shocking to say that, and especially colonial archives, because, for example, we had these. They have to present about graphic novel on tirailleurs sénégalais, and they saw how the French colonial authority has framed archives to minimize the number of people, the number of tirailleurs they have killed, to totally lie about why they were mobilizing, all this kind of thing. So when you have this kind of true stories, it leads you to understand that archives are fictions. So the question is more about like which kind of fiction do we valorize as reliable, and which kind are we consider as totally fictional. And we are also like, I think, and he also talked about this idea of memories and how we deal with it. I think for me, the more I think about it and the more I'm trying to work on this decolonial lens, I was talking about this idea of plurality and plasticity, is to be able to accept that there is no objectivity. It doesn't exist at all. This is a fiction. This is a fiction of the dominant to impose their narrative, right? So it's about like how we articulate all this subjectivity to get closer to something that can be seen as kind of truth, but a sharing truth. But to be shared, this truth need to be plural, need to integrate different view, right? So I think if you work with fiction, and I think that's the way the path you, and it will ask you also to craft, because we are still living in a world where very rigid, very colonial, and then like not all the people, I say that every time to my student, not all, even my colleague, will agree with what I say, but that this is my position, like methodologically, epistemologically, and politically.
Thank you. I'll pick up two questions here, and I also answer to this question how the feminist perspective affects my teaching. But I respond to that with a story. Recently, I learned that my students gossip about me. Surprise! Surprise, right? So I learned that they gossip about me. This is what they tell each other. Are you taking class with Dr. Oliveira? She'll force you to read women's work. And she'll talk about women in every class. And be prepared in your paper. If you don't include women scholars or Africans, she will not like it. Well, this is all true. That's not only gossip, but that's also true. So as a feminist historian, I'm committed to including women as a topic in my courses, not only as an isolated topic. Yeah. Okay, today we'll talk about women and gender and sexualities. No, we talk about it in every class. Every class I ask my students, how does it impact women, right? And people of other, sexual orientations, right? I'm committed to including 50% of the historiography in my syllabus from women scholars. And I also force my students to include women scholars and Africans, scholars from the global south. in their papers. If they don't list that, I say that's not diverse enough, right? I think we have to come out of this bubble that we not only control the publication market, right? We scholars based in North America and Europe, but we also tend to only read each other. And this is not admissible that in an African history course, I teach African history courses, I teach courses on women and gender, and also in colonialism, that we don't read scholars from the global south, that we don't read the people who are colonized and learn how they are writing their own stories, right? Otherwise, we are only reproducing the same stories, right? So,
For example, because Rose can read the literature in French, like so that also already diversifies your conversation.
Yeah, and I do understand that there is a language barrier, but I tell my students, hey, a lot of the countries in Africa, people speak English, right? Those people they are producing, there are universities in Africa, so go out there, do your work, search, right? Everybody in this country has access to a computer. You have access to database, so there is no excuse not to read the work of African scholars, right? So that's not acceptable. And my students know it, and I'm pleased with the gossip about me that's going around the campus, right? And the other question that I'd like to touch upon is regarding the digital archive. I have to say I'm so jealous of people who go to the archives and take pictures of documents, right? Or they have digitized the archives that they can just search online. That's not possible in Angola. They don't allow the people to take picture of the document. I was doing research in Angola this past summer, and things have changed a lot. The National Archive has this gigantic, fancy building, and now you can pay, and they will digitize the material for you, but they don't allow researchers to digitize the material themselves. So basically, you go to the archive, you pay, or you transcribe, right, the material. So digitization is possible in the sense that you come maybe with a grant if you are a professor, right? That you have funds to do research and you pay for people to digitize for you. But other than that, it's not a reality. It's not a possibility in the case of Angola, right? Maybe I'll leave it here. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, we can do better than that. Let's give them. Thank you all so much. This was a wonderful roundtable. It really got all of us going. I think we could go for a little more, but we need to listen to our bodies and the fire codes, I guess. No. Thank you so much. So this was our last Tubman Talk of the month. That is right. It is the end of January, and we are jumping into Black History Month in a couple of days. So we have a lot of great things going on at the Tubman Institute. On February 6th, we have a panel, Politics and Labor. So our theme this year for Black History Month is labor. And so we have a lot of great stuff going on. So February 6th, we are doing politics and labor. We have MP Matthew Green. We have Sarah Jama coming through on the heel of announcing her new election bid. And we have Sabrina Dahal from the district school board, and Nicole Wandrun from the caregiver organization. And there's more people that I didn't know that were coming. This is really exciting. And that's for February 6th. February 13th, the theme is racial justice and labor, and this will actually be taking place not at the Tubman Center, but at the Nat Taylor Cinema. And here we are speaking directly to union and union leaders to discover the way in which labor and racial justice work together. So we're going to have folks from QP, QP 4400, QP 3903. REC, UFA, OPSEU, all these acronyms, man. And YFS. So looking at the different ways in which these different unions are thinking about the work of labor and racial justice. And then it's reading week. And then we come back all refreshed on February 27th for our last panel on community organizing, specifically looking at different community organizing that deal with Black communities. So we have folks from Parents of Black Children coming, somebody from the Toronto Caribbean Festival, and also somebody from Black Queer Youth Collective, and looking at the labor of doing that community work in communities. So we are incredibly excited for our Black History Month scheduling, and we hope to see you all there. Thank you all.